Hello my YouTube friends, it's me, your old buddy Magnum, and welcome to the Thursday Videography and Photography Show. Tonight we are going to go back to the very basics and talk about the exposure triangle. Now, I know a lot of you are photographers and have been shooting images for a long time and you're very familiar with the exposure triangle. However, some of you may be new to photography, you may be new to YouTube, and you've got a camera that you shoot everything in auto mode, and you've never messed around with the shutter speed or the aperture or the ISO. So we're going to discuss those three elements of the exposure triangle and give you a better understanding of how it all works together so you can become a better photographer and a better videographer. The three elements of the exposure triangle are the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. Now, the ISO is what we used to call film speed back in the day when we used celluloid film in our cameras. This was before digital imaging. The higher the number, the more sensitive the sensor on your camera is to light. So if you've got a low light situation, you can crank the ISO up and make your sensor more sensitive. The aperture is the second element, and that is how wide your shutter opens. So the wider it opens, each time it opens, the more light it lets in. So if you've got a high ISO and a wide aperture, you're going to get maximum light in there. The third element is your shutter speed. The longer the shutter is open, the more light comes in. So it's a balancing act to get all three of those elements set correctly so that you get the right exposure. Now you can get the right exposure with three different settings on all three of those elements. So the last thing that comes into play there is your depth of field. If you want a very shallow depth of field, you need to have a wide aperture, which means you can you can lower your ISO, or you can decrease your shutter speed. I hope this isn't getting confusing. I know it can be, but anyway, going back to shutter speed real quickly. In video, well, in photography, shutter speed is probably your first element of change. If you're overexposed, you just decrease the shutter speed. If you're underexposed, you let the shutter stay open longer. But in video, it's a little bit different. I typically shoot at 24 frames per second. Some people shoot at 30 frames per second. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you want to have your shutter speed twice that number. So your shutter speed would be 1/60th. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/50th because there's no setting for 1/48th. But 1/50th is close enough. So we're going to do some test shots tonight and vary the ISO and the aperture. We're not going to change the shutter speed because we need to leave it set at 1/50th. So I'm currently shooting this at f5.6 with an ISO of 6400. So I'm going to make a change and show you what happens. So stay right there. Okay, if this image looks a little bit brighter, maybe a little bit overexposed, that's because I changed one element of the exposure triangle. I opened the f-stop from 5.6 to 4, but I didn't change the ISO. So, and I'm going to leave the shutter speed at 1/50th throughout this video, so that's not an element, a factor that's going to be involved. So let me change the ISO and get us back to the right exposure. Does that look better? I think so too. I left the f-stop at f4 and I changed the ISO from 6400 down to 3200, which would be an equivalent change based on the aperture change. So let's make one more adjustment, and hopefully it'll give you a better idea of how you can make changes and still keep your exposure correct. Hopefully that looks about the same as the previous exposure that we had. What I did was move the ISO down from 3200 to 1600, and I opened the aperture from f4 to f2. So by altering, by doubling one and halving the other, you can keep pretty much a level exposure going on. So I hope that's helpful. I know it's probably confusing to some of you who may not be familiar with it, and I'm probably not explaining it as well as I could, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them down below. I will try to answer every one. If you have any comments, leave those as well. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. And until I speak with you again, and even after that, you stay focused.